Most people think the military is defined by the medals on a chest or the stripes on a sleeve. But the real history of our service isn't written in textbooks. It's etched into the scars and the silent rituals of those who survived the missions we aren't allowed to talk about. I spent 10 years flying Apaches, thinking I understood the bond of brotherhood. But everything I knew was challenged on a quiet night in Hangar 4. I saw a 3-star general, a man of iron and stone, come to a complete halt in front of a grease-stained mechanic. He didn't see a subordinate, he saw a legacy. When he delivered that silent salute, he wasn't honoring her rank. He was honoring a sacrifice that had been officially erased from history. My name is Captain Miller, and this is the true story of the woman who was just a mechanic, and the secret patch that brought a general to his knees. The hum of the ventilation system in Hangar 4 was the only thing keeping the silence from becoming absolute. It was 0300 a.m. at Fort Campbell. Outside, the Kentucky fog was so thick you couldn't see the runway lights. But inside, under the harsh white glow of the LED arrays, everything was clinical. My Apache, tail number 7 Echo 9er, sat in the center of the floor like a sleeping predator. I had stayed late to go over the pre-flight checks myself. I liked the quiet. It gave me time to think. But tonight, I wasn't alone. Working on the M230 chain gun, the heart of the Apache's lethality, was Staff Sergeant Sarah Vance. She had arrived at the base 3 weeks ago. She didn't socialize, she didn't complain about the double shifts, she just worked. I watched her from across the hangar. She was holding a single bolt up to the light, turning it slowly between her fingers. Most mechanics treat these parts like hardware. She treated them like fragile glass. There was a level of respect in her movements that felt different. It felt like she knew exactly what that gun was capable of doing, and what it felt like when it failed. I walked over, my footsteps echoing against the polished concrete. "You're still here, Vance?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "The maintenance crew logged off 4 hours ago." She didn't look up. Her hands remained steady as she applied a thin layer of specialized lubricant to the firing assembly. "Precision doesn't follow a clock, Captain," she replied. Her voice was steady, lacking the usual nervousness most sergeants showed around a commanding officer. "The logs say this gun had a minor feed malfunction during the last live fire. I'm making sure it doesn't happen again." "It was a minor jam, Sarah. We cleared it in 30 seconds, I said, leaning against the workbench. 30 seconds is a lifetime when you're hovering at 300 feet in a narrow valley, she countered, finally looking me in the eye. Her gaze was unsettling. Most people in the military have the look, that 1,000-yard stare, but her eyes were different. They were observant, calculating every detail of my posture, my breathing, my gear. It wasn't the look of a mechanic, it was the look of a survivor. As she reached over to grab a torque wrench, the light caught her left shoulder. Her coveralls were slightly unzipped at the top due to the heat of the hangar, revealing the sleeve of her olive-drab undershirt. There, sewn with meticulous care, was a patch. It wasn't the 101st Airborne, it wasn't a standard unit insignia. It was a faded, circular patch made of dark, non-reflective material. In the center was a silver raven, its wings spread, clutching a broken arrow in its talons. No words, no numbers, just that haunting image. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. My mind flashed back to a classified briefing I had accidentally witnessed years ago, a briefing about a unit that didn't exist, Task Force Raven. They were the broken arrow specialists. If a mission went catastrophically wrong, if a team was lost behind enemy lines and the government needed a ghost to go in and either bring them back or burn the evidence, they sent the Ravens. "Vance," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "That patch, where were you stationed before this?" She froze. The torque wrench stayed perfectly still in her hand. For 5 seconds, she didn't breathe. Then she slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing. "I was nowhere, Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And if you're as smart as they say you are, you'll forget you ever saw that." Before I could respond, the heavy motorized hangar doors began to rumble. The sound was deafening in the empty space. A line of black vehicles, the kind that usually stay parked at the Pentagon, drove onto the hangar floor. The door of the lead vehicle opened, and General Richard Sterling stepped out. Sterling was a legend. 3 stars, a chest full of medals. He was known as the Iron Guard, a man who had made the hardest calls in the modern era of warfare. Behind him were 3 men in suits, government contractors, handlers. I snapped to attention, my salute crisp and professional. "General Sterling, sir. We weren't expecting an inspection at this hour." Sterling ignored me. He didn't even see the helicopter. He walked straight toward the workbench. His eyes were fixed on Sarah Vance. As he got closer, his pace slowed. His face, usually a mask of stone, began to crack. I saw his eyes move to the patch on her shoulder. The general stopped exactly 3 feet away. In that moment, the entire world seemed to stop. The agency men in the background stood perfectly still. I watched breathless as General Sterling, a man who outranked everyone for 300 miles, slowly brought his hand to his brow. He didn't give a standard military salute. He gave a salute of deep, agonizing respect. "I told them the fire wouldn't be enough to take you, Sarah," the general said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told them the Raven always finds her way home." Vance didn't salute back. She simply wiped the grease from her hands onto a rag and nodded. "The fire took my team, General. I'm just the part that wouldn't burn." I stood there, a witness to a meeting that shouldn't have been happening. I realized then that the woman cleaning my gun wasn't hiding from the enemy. She was hiding from the very people who had sent her into the dark. And that patch on her shoulder was the only thing left of a unit that had sacrificed everything for a country that had promised to forget them. The general's hand finally dropped, but the tension in the hangar remained pulled tight, like a tripwire waiting for a footfall. The 3 men in suits, the handlers, moved in a synchronized perimeter, their eyes scanning the rafters and the dark corners of the facility. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like cleaners. They were the kind of men who made problems disappear before the sun came up. General Sterling turned to me, his eyes regaining that cold, professional steel. "Captain Miller, take a walk. Secure the perimeter of this hangar. No one enters, no one leaves. And Miller?" He paused, his voice dropping an octave. "Log out of the security feed for the next 30 minutes. If I see a recording of this, I won't just take your wings. I'll make sure you're forgotten." "Yes, sir," I stammered. I didn't argue. You don't argue with a man who has a direct line to the Joint Chiefs. I walked toward the side exit, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did exactly what he said. I cut the feed to the internal cameras and stepped out into the biting Kentucky fog. But I didn't go far. I stood by the heavy steel door, the cold air lunging at my lungs, trying to process what I had just seen. A general saluting a mechanic. A raven patch. Shadow peak. Inside, the conversation was muffled by the thick insulation of the hangar, but the gravity of it leaked through the walls. Sarah Vance wasn't just a survivor. She was a liability. In the world of high-stakes intelligence, there is no such thing as a retired ghost. You are either active or you are a loose end. And looking at those men in suits, I knew which one they thought she was. 10 minutes later, the door groaned open. The general stepped out, followed by his shadows. He didn't look at me as he climbed back into the black SUV. The vehicles roared to life, their tires screeching against the tarmac as they sped back toward the main command center. I waited until the taillights vanished into the fog before I stepped back inside. The hangar felt different now. The silence was heavier. Vance was back at the workbench, but she wasn't working. She was staring at the raven patch, her fingers tracing the silver threads of the bird of prey. "They want you to come back in, don't they?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vast space. She didn't look up. "They don't want me back, Captain. They want the drive." "What drive?" She finally turned, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. Not the fear of a person scared for their life, but the fear of a person who knew a secret that could burn the world down. When Shadow Peak was hit, it wasn't an ambush by insurgents, it was a targeted strike by our own contractors. We had found something in that mountain, data that proved a group of private interests was funding both sides of the war to keep the mineral contracts flowing. My team, my family, they were murdered to keep that data silent. She reached into the collar of her undershirt and pulled out a small, ruggedized USB drive hanging on a dog tag chain. I was the only one who made it to the extraction point. I've spent 2 years moving, changing names, hiding in motor pools and hangars. I thought if I stayed close to the machines, I'd be safe. I thought they'd think I was dead.
"But the general found you," I said. "Sterling was the only one who didn't know the truth back then. He gave the order for the fire strike because they told him we were already gone. He's been carrying that guilt for a decade. But those men with him? They aren't his. They're the consultants. They work for the people on that drive." I looked at my Apache. It was no longer just a weapon of war. It was the only thing between this woman and the people who wanted her erased. "What happens now?" I asked. Vance stood up, her jaw set in a hard line. "Now, the Ghost Protocol begins. They've confirmed I'm alive. By dawn, this hangar will be crawled by people who don't care about rank or protocol. They'll come for the drive, and they'll kill anyone who has seen it." She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "You should leave, Miller. Go home. Tell them you were tired and went to your quarters. If you stay here, you're part of the conspiracy." I looked at my flight suit. I looked at the stars and stripes on the wall. I thought about why I joined the Army. It wasn't to fly fancy machines. It was to protect the person standing next to me. "I'm not going anywhere, Sergeant," I said, reaching for my flight helmet. "You said that gun has a burr on the firing pin? Let's finish fixing it. If they're coming by dawn, I want the Reaper ready to talk back." She stared at me for a long beat, then a small, grim smile touched her lips. She picked up the torque wrench and handed it to me. "The torque setting is 85 foot-pounds, Captain. Don't strip the bolt. We only have one shot at this." We worked through the night in a feverish, silent rhythm. Every sound outside, the shifting of the wind, or the distant rumble of a truck, made us freeze. We weren't just a pilot and a mechanic anymore. We were 2 people preparing for a war that hadn't been declared yet. By 4:30 a.m., the Apache was fully reassembled. The chain gun was oiled, the sensors were calibrated, and the Raven patch was hidden back under Sarah's sleeve. But as the first hint of gray light began to bleed through the fog, we heard it. Not the sound of base security, but the low, rhythmic thrum of an approaching helicopter. An unmarked Black Hawk flying low, with its lights blacked out. They weren't waiting for dawn. They were coming now. The sound of the approaching Black Hawk wasn't like the usual base traffic. It was a predatory hum, low, muffled, and deliberate. In my years of flying, I had learned to distinguish the sound of a standard transport from a bird outfitted for special activities. This one had the high-pitched whine of modified rotors, designed to slip through the air without alerting the ground. Sarah Vance didn't need to be told. She was already moving. She didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who haven't died before. Instead, she methodically began clearing the workbench. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the thrum of the rotors, "if they land, the first thing they'll do is lock down the hangar's power grid. We'll be in the dark within 90 seconds. "I have the emergency override codes," I said, reaching for my flight vest. "But they won't hold if they physically cut the lines." "They won't cut the lines yet," she countered, her eyes scanning the high steel rafters of Hangar 4. "They want the drive. They need light to find it. They think I'm still just a mechanic caught in the crossfire. They don't know you're in here,
and they don't know I've been expecting them for 2 years. I watched her reach into the hollow frame of a tool chest and pull out a compact, matte black sidearm. It wasn't standard army issue. It was a ghost's weapon.
"Miller," she said, looking me dead in the eye as the vibrations of the landing helicopter began to rattle the hangar's corrugated metal walls. "Once they step through those doors, there is no going back. You are a captain in the United States Army. If you stay, you are technically engaging in an unsanctioned firefight against men with high-level clearance. You could be branded a traitor before the sun hits the horizon." I looked at the raven patch on her shoulder, then at the Apache behind her. "I've spent my life following orders, Sarah, but tonight I'm following the truth. Let's show them what a raven and a reaper can do." Suddenly, the hangar was bathed in a blinding searchlight from above. The Black Hawk hovered just outside the main doors, its downwash kicking up dust and grit that whistled through the gaps in the steel. The hangar's main lights flickered and died. Total darkness swallowed us. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the ringing in my ears. Then, the red emergency tactical lights kicked in, bathing the Apache and the workbench in a bloody, surreal glow. Clank! The side personnel door was kicked open. 3 figures moved in, silhouetted against the gray morning fog. They wore tactical gear with no insignia, no names, no flags, no country. They moved with a terrifying, robotic efficiency. Night vision goggles flipped down, green glowing eyes searching the red-lit void. "Staff Sergeant Vance," a voice boomed, echoing off the metallic walls. It was Graves, the man from the previous day, his voice amplified by a comms unit. "We know you're in here. We know about the captain. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Hand over the drive, and the captain walks away with his career intact. You have my word." Vance was gone. She had vanished into the shadows of the Apache's tail rotor the moment the lights went out. "Your word is as empty as the mountain you left us on, Graves," she shouted, her voice seeming to come from 3 places at once, a trick of the hangar's acoustics she had clearly studied. "Search the bird," Graves commanded. 2 of the operatives moved toward the Apache. My heart hammered. I was crouched behind a heavy crate of 30mm ammunition, my hand gripping my service pistol. I wasn't a Tier 1 operator. I was a pilot. My battlefield was the sky, not a grease-stained floor. The first operative reached the cockpit ladder. As his hand touched the metal, a shadow dropped from the gantry above. It was Vance. She didn't use her gun. She hit him with the weight of a falling star, her boots connecting with his chest. Before the second operative could level his rifle, she had spun behind the first man, using him as a human shield. Pop, pop, pop! 3 suppressed shots rang out. Not from Vance, but from Graves, firing ruthlessly through his own man to get to her. Vance rolled behind the heavy landing gear of the Apache. "Miller, now!" I didn't think. I kicked the release on the heavy ammunition crate, sending it sliding across the polished floor toward the second operative. He tripped, his rifle firing a wild burst into the ceiling. I lunged forward, tackling him. It was a messy, desperate struggle. He was stronger, trained for this, but I had the desperation of a man who had nowhere left to run. We tumbled across the floor, over oil pans and discarded wrenches. Above us, the heavy chain gun of the Apache, the one Vance had spent hours perfecting, loomed like a silent judge. Vance appeared from the darkness, a blur of motion. She neutralized Graves' second man with a clinical strike to the temple. But Graves was still out there. He was a professional, and he had realized the hangar was a kill box. "You think you're heroes?" Graves' voice came from the dark, further back now. "You're defending a lie. That drive won't save anyone. It'll just start a war you aren't prepared to fight." "A war is already happening, Graves," Vance shouted back, her breath ragged. "You just don't like it when the targets start shooting back." Suddenly, a loud metallic thud echoed. The main hangar doors, the massive 5-ton steel slabs, began to slide shut. Vance looked at me, her eyes wide in the red light. "The general," she whispered. "He's sealing the hangar." General Sterling hadn't left. He was outside, and he had just turned Hangar 4 into a tomb for whoever was left inside. "Miller, get in the cockpit," Vance commanded, her voice turning into a whip. "What? In here? We can't fly in here." "We aren't flying," she said, leaping onto the wing stub. "But that gun you just cleaned? It's the only thing Graves can't hide from. If he gets to the shadows, we're dead. We need the thermal sensors." I scrambled into the front seat, the smell of leather and sweat filling my senses. I flipped the battery switches. The cockpit screens flickered to life, a symphony of green and gold data. I slaved the M230 chain gun to my helmet's sight. Everywhere I looked, the gun followed. On my integrated helmet and display sighting system, IHADS, the world turned into a heat-mapped ghostland. I saw the heat from the engine of the Black Hawk outside. I saw the heat from the dead men on the floor. And then, tucked behind the heavy steel pillar near the fuel pumps, I saw a glowing white silhouette.
Graves. He was holding a thermal-coated grenade. He wasn't trying to capture us anymore. He was going to blow the fuel lines and take the whole hangar and the drive into the afterlife. "Vance, he's at the pumps!" I yelled. I looked at Graves through the digital crosshairs. My finger hovered over the trigger of the 30mm. One burst would end him, but it would also ignite the hangar. "Don't shoot the gun!" Vance screamed, realizing my intent. She didn't wait. She leapt from the Apache, a silhouette of pure defiance, and sprinted straight toward the man with the grenade. The world inside Hangar 4 turned into a blur of red light and freezing shadows. As Sarah Vance sprinted toward the fuel pumps, her silhouette against the red emergency glow looked less like a human and more like a ghost reclaiming its territory. I sat in the cockpit, my hands white-knuckled on the controls, watching the thermal feed. Through the IAH-DSS, Graves was a pulsing white figure, a beacon of heat and malice. He was holding the grenade high, his thumb hovering over the safety lever. He didn't care about his own life anymore. In the world of high-level espionage, failure isn't just a career ender, it's a death sentence. Graves knew that if he walked out of this hangar without the drive, his own employers would do far worse to him than anything we could imagine. He was ready to go up in flames, taking the truth with him. "Vance, stop!" I screamed over the comms, but she wasn't listening. She couldn't. She hit him at full speed. It wasn't a tactical takedown, it was a collision. They slammed into the heavy steel fuel pipes, the sound of the impact echoing like a thunderclap. The grenade slipped from Graves' hand, skittering across the concrete floor. My heart stopped. I watched the thermal signature of the grenade. If that pin was pulled, we had exactly 4 seconds before the high-octane fuel lines ignited, turning the entire hangar into a pressurized furnace. "The pin!" I yelled, leaning out of the cockpit, ready to jump. Vance and Graves were locked in a desperate, primal struggle on the floor. Graves was a big man, built like a tank, but Vance moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. She wasn't fighting like a soldier, she was fighting like someone who had been forged in a furnace. She used the environment, the edge of the tool chest, the hardness of the floor, the heavy steel of the pipes as weapons. She managed to pin Graves' arm, her knee driving into his chest with a sickening crunch. With her free hand, she reached out, her fingers clawing at the concrete, desperately searching for the grenade in the dark. Graves roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and threw his weight into her, pinning her against the workbench. He grabbed a heavy industrial wrench from the table, the same one Vance had used earlier to fix my gun, and swung it with lethal intent. Vance ducked, the wrench whistling over her head and smashing into the metal frame of the Apache's tail rotor. "Miller, the grenade!" she gasped, her voice strained under Graves' weight. I scrambled out of the cockpit, sliding down the side of the helicopter. I hit the floor and scrambled on all fours through the dark, my fingers frantically searching the cold concrete. There, I felt the cold, serrated metal of the grenade. My fingers closed around it. I checked the pin. It was in, just barely. The safety lever had bent during the fall, but it hadn't released. I looked up, just in time to see Graves kick Vance away and reach for his suppressed sidearm on the floor. Clang! The sound didn't come from a gun. It came from the hangar doors. The massive steel slabs began to grind open again, but only halfway. The gray, misty light of dawn poured in, cutting through the red tactical haze. Standing in the gap was a lone figure, General Richard Sterling. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a squad of MPs, not the consultants, but real uniformed soldiers with MP stenciled on their vests, rushed in with tactical lights. "Drop the weapon," Sterling's voice boomed, amplified by a megaphone. "Graves, stand down. This operation is over." Graves froze, his hand inches from his pistol. He looked at the general, then at the MPs, then at Vance, who was standing slowly, her face bruised and her lip bleeding. "You're making a mistake, Sterling," Graves spat, his voice echoing. "You know who gave the order for this extraction. You can't stop it." "I gave the order to secure this facility," Sterling said, walking forward with a heavy, rhythmic stride. He didn't look like a man in his 60s. He looked like a god of war. "And I've just been informed that your contract has been officially terminated by the Department of Justice. You're under arrest for the attempted murder of a United States Army officer and a civilian contractor." The agency men, the handlers who had been with Sterling earlier, looked at each other. They realized the tide had turned. Sterling hadn't been working with them. He had been playing them, waiting for them to commit a crime on military soil where he had total jurisdiction. The MPs swarmed Graves, pinning him to the floor and zip-tying his hands behind his back. The two unconscious men near the Apache were also hauled away. Sterling walked over to Vance. He looked at her for a long time. The raven patch on her shoulder was now fully visible in the morning light. "I couldn't protect your team 10 years ago, Sarah," the general said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'll be damned if I let them take you again." Vance didn't say anything. She reached into her collar, pulled out the dog tag chain with the USB drive, and handed it to Sterling. "Everything is on here, Richard. Every name, every offshore account, every coordinate of the Shadow Peak site. Don't lose it this time." Sterling took the drive, his hand steady. "I'm taking this directly to the Senate Intelligence Committee. I have a transport waiting. Captain Miller?" I stood up, still holding the grenade, my heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. "Yes, sir?" "You did well today. You protected a sister-in-arms when the world turned its back on her. I'm putting a letter in your file, one that says you showed exemplary initiative in a classified training exercise. That's all the world will ever know." He turned to Vance. "And Sarah, you're officially listed as KIA in the new records. You're a ghost again, but this time a ghost with a clean slate. Where will you go?" Vance looked at the Apache, then at me, then at the open hangar doors where the sun was finally starting to burn through the fog. "I think I'll stay here for a while," she said, picking up her wrench. "This gun still has a burr on the firing pin, and someone has to make sure Captain Miller doesn't fall out of the sky." Sterling nodded, turned on his heel, and walked into the light. But as the MPs cleared the hangar and the silence returned, I saw Vance look at her shoulder. She slowly reached up and peeled the raven patch off. The Velcro made a sharp, ripping sound. She looked at it for a second, then handed it to me. "You keep it, Elias," she said. "I don't need to be a raven anymore. I think I'd rather just be a mechanic." I took the patch, the silver bird of prey looking back at me. I realized then that the war wasn't over. The people on that drive wouldn't go away quietly. But as I looked at Sarah Vance, who was already back under the belly of the Apache, I knew that whatever was coming, we were ready. The secret was out. The ghost was home. And for the first time in 10 years, the raven was at peace. The aftermath of a battle isn't marked by the silence. It's marked by the ringing in your ears.
even after the MPs had hauled Graves away and the general's convoy had vanished into the morning light, Hangar 4 felt like a crime scene that was being scrubbed from reality. By 09 hours, the base was operating as if nothing had happened. But for me, the world had fundamentally shifted. I stood in the doorway of the hangar, a cup of bitter black coffee in my hand, watching a cleanup crew in unmarked jumpsuits power wash the oil and blood from the concrete. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They were professionals at making history disappear. Sarah Vance was gone, not from the base, but from the surface. Following the general's orders, she had been moved to a secure safe house barracks on the far north side of the installation. Officially, Staff Sergeant Vance was on temporary leave for personal reasons. I spent the day in a daze. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silver raven clutching the broken arrow. Every time I heard a helicopter, I checked the tail numbers, half expecting an unmarked Black Hawk to drop from the clouds. 3 days later, I was summoned to the base commander's office. It wasn't General Sterling waiting for me. It was a man I'd never seen, a civilian with a face like a blank sheet of paper and a suit that cost more than my Apache.
"Sit down, Captain Miller," he said, not looking up from a thick folder. "I'm with the Office of Special Investigations. I'm here to discuss the training exercise in Hangar 4. "I was told that was classified, sir," I replied, sitting stiffly. "It is. So classified that most of this folder is redacted," he said, turning it around. I looked at the pages. They were almost entirely blacked out. Only my name and the date were visible. "The data on the drive you and Sergeant Vance recovered has caused significant ripples in Washington. 3 senators have retired this morning. A major defense contractor is facing a federal freeze on all assets." He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "But people like Graves? They don't just go to jail. They have friends, powerful friends, who are very upset that a ghost decided to haunt them." "Is she safe?" I asked, ignoring the threat in his voice. "She is under my protection for now, but you, Captain, you are a problem. You've seen things that require a high-level clearance you don't possess. Usually, we'd just relocate you to a desk job in Alaska, but General Sterling insisted that you stay with your bird." He pushed a piece of paper across the desk. "Sign this. It's a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. If you ever mention the name Shadow Peak or the Raven Unit or what happened to that firing pin, you won't just go to Leavenworth. You'll simply cease to exist." I signed it without a second thought. My loyalty wasn't to the government. It was to the truth I'd seen in Sarah's eyes. When I returned to the hangar that evening, the cleaners were gone. The floor was spotless. The Apache was gleaming, and sitting on the edge of the workbench, looking at a set of blueprints, was Sarah. She looked tired. The bruise on her cheek had turned a deep purple, and her hands were bandaged. But when she saw me, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who had finally put down a heavy burden. "They tried to make me sign a new contract," she said, not looking up from the prints. "A Tier 1 slot. Tactical advisor for the new Spec Ops wing. Did you take it?" She looked at me and laughed, a short, dry sound. "I told them I'd rather clean toilets. I'm done with the shadows, Elias. I want to work on things that stay where I put them." "The OSI guy said you're under protection. That doesn't sound like a quiet life." "Protection is just another word for a cage," she said, standing up. "Sterling is doing his best, but he knows as well as I do that the people on that drive won't stop. They've already sent a second team to the mountain to destroy the physical evidence." I felt a surge of anger. So it was all for nothing? The drive? The fight? Graves? "No," she said, walking over to the Apache. "The drive was the spark. The fire is just starting. Sterling didn't go to the Senate. He went to the international press.
He leaked the encryption keys to 3 different news agencies before the OSI could stop him. By tomorrow morning, every headline in the world will have the names of the men who betrayed Shadow Peak. I stared at her. That's suicide. They'll come for both of you with everything they have. Let 'em come, she said, her voice turning into that cold, sharp blade I remembered from the night of the attack. They're used to fighting ghosts. They aren't used to fighting people who have nothing left to lose. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. It was the firing pin from the M230 chain gun, the one with the microscopic burr. I kept this, she said, a reminder that even the smallest flaw can bring down the biggest machine. We aren't just mechanics and pilots anymore, Elias. We're the flaw in their system.
Just then, my radio crackled. Captain Miller, this is Command. We have an unscheduled mission profile. Urgent extract at grid 44-9er. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Your tech is already assigned. I looked at Sarah. She was already grabbing her flight helmet. That's not a standard grid, I said. That's the General's private estate. Then the hunt has begun, Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a renewed fire. Get in the seat, Captain. The Reaper has work to do. As I climbed into the cockpit and felt the engines roar to life, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much larger war. One that wouldn't be fought in the shadows, but in the open, with the roar of an Apache and the precision of a Raven. The roar of the T-700 engines was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, vibrating through my chest and into the marrow of my bones. Hangar 4 was a whirlwind of dust and spent air as the Reaper clawed its way into the gray Kentucky sky. Beside me, in the co-gunner's seat, Sarah Vance wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was wearing a flight suit that fit her like a second skin, her eyes locked onto the targeting systems with a calm that only comes to those who have already looked death in the face and won. The mission was simple, but the implications were monumental. We were heading toward the General's private estate, a secluded mountain retreat where Sterling had taken the final remnants of the Shadow Peak files. But the consultants were already on the move. Our radar was picking up 2 unidentified signatures, fast-moving birds, blacked out, coming from the east. They aren't coming to talk, Elias. Sarah's voice came over the comms, cold and precise. They're coming to burn it all down, the General, the files, and us. Let them try, I replied, banking the Apache hard to the left, the G-force pushing us into our seats. We're flying a bird they built. We know every weakness. As we cleared the ridge, the General's estate came into view. It was a beautiful stone house perched on the edge of a cliff. But the beauty was marred by the sight of smoke rising from the perimeter. The first blacked-out Black Hawk was already hovering, dropping fast-roping teams onto the lawn. "Thermal sensors active," Sarah reported. "I have 15 targets on the ground. They're breaching the north entrance. Elias, if we don't stop them now, Sterling won't make it to the press conference." I dived. The world rushed up to meet us. The Apache's nose dipped, and I slaved the M230 chain gun, the same gun Sarah had meticulously cleaned and polished, to my helmet. "Clear the lawn," I commanded. The gun spoke. Thump, thump, thump. The 30mm rounds didn't just hit the ground, they pulverized it. We weren't aiming for the men, we were aiming for their cover. The sheer psychological terror of an Apache hovering 50 feet above you is usually enough to end a fight. But these weren't ordinary men. They were mercenaries with nothing to lose. They fired back. Small arms fire pinged against our armored belly like hail on a tin roof. "Take the bird, Sarah! Focus on the Black Hawk!" I yelled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She toggled the Hellfire missile system. "Target locked. Painting the bird." The Black Hawk tried to bank away, realizing its vulnerability. It began to deploy flares, bright magnesium stars falling toward the trees. But Sarah was a Raven. She knew the countermeasures. She waited. She watched the heat signature through the digital haze. "Wait for it," she whispered. "Now!" The hellfire roared off the rail, a streak of white fire against the darkening sky. It didn't miss. The Black Hawk turned into a ball of orange flame, spinning out of the air and crashing into the valley below. The second bird saw the fate of its partner and turned tail, disappearing back into the fog. The remaining mercenaries on the ground threw down their weapons. They knew when the game was up. I landed the Reaper on the General's helipad, the rotors slowly winding down. General Sterling stepped out onto the porch, his face pale but his eyes bright. He looked at the smoking wreckage in the valley, then at the Apache, and finally at the two of us climbing out of the cockpit. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked up to Sarah and handed her a small, physical folder. "It's done, Sarah," he said, his voice weary. "The story is live. The world knows. They can't hide anymore." Sarah took the folder. She looked at the General, then at the raven patch I had pinned to my flight suit. For the first time in the 3 weeks I'd known her, she looked truly at peace. "So, what happens to us now?" I asked, looking at the horizon where the sun was finally setting. "Now?" Sterling smiled, a small, sad smile. "Now we live. We stay in the light, and we make sure that when the next shadow peak happens, there's someone there to stop it." The war in the shadows had been won, but the road ahead was long. We weren't just soldiers anymore. We were guardians of a truth that had almost been lost to time. As we stood there on that mountain, watching the stars come out, I realized that the woman cleaning the machine gun had done more than just fix a weapon. She had fixed a broken legacy. The Raven had found her way home. And the Reaper? The Reaper was finally at rest. In a world where secrets are used as currency, the bravest thing you can do is stand by the truth. Sarah Vance was a ghost who refused to be forgotten. General Sterling was a leader who chose honor over his career. And Captain Miller? He was a pilot who realized that the most important mission is the one that happens when the cameras are off. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey through the shadows of military history. This story is a tribute to the silent heroes, the mechanics, the techs, and the operators who keep the world safe while we sleep. If you found this story powerful, please hit the like button and share it with someone who respects the uniform. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the untold tales of courage and conspiracy. What would you have done if you saw that patch? Let us know in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay loyal, and most importantly, stay vigilant. We'll see you in the next one.